The fog rolled in low over the Baltic coast. Thin and fast, it moved like it was trying to outrun the dawn itself. The air tasted like salt and boot rubber, and the faint hum of helicopters echoed from the distance. Lieutenant Commander Ria Voss stepped onto the training grounds with her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, already in full uniform. No entourage, no greetings, just a cold, steady gaze. Her name, Voss, was already posted on the assignment board. She didn't look at it. She knew it well enough. Today, she would lead the next training cycle at the Wojsko Polskia's Elite Unit Training Center. Her uniform was plain, without medals or any sign of a SEAL trident, just a few simple ribbons on her chest. She had earned none of it from anyone's applause. Her reputation was earned in silence. The instructors, leaning against the wall behind the admin trailer, eyed her with suspicion. One of them smirked. Another office-bound officer. "Let's see how long she lasts in the field," he muttered. Ria heard it, but didn't respond. She didn't need to. The morning assembly was brief. The commander read the formal orders. Lieutenant Commander Voss will oversee the integration drills for the next 6 weeks. Her prior missions are classified, and her authority is affirmed by Central Command. No applause, no nods, just an uneasy silence. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She simply observed, registering every subtle look and gesture. A few minutes later, she made her way to the training field, her eyes scanning the obstacle course. She walked alone, no clipboard or assistant, just steady purpose. The 2 instructors from earlier followed her with their eyes. "She's quiet. She thinks silence is strength," one said, snickering. The other didn't respond, but the challenge was clear. "We'll see how she does." By mid-morning, the fog had burned off, and the sky over the training grounds was a clear, cloudless blue. The sun beat down, making the sand shimmer, while recruits stood in formation along the shoreline. They were wearing weighted vests, their breaths coming sharp and heavy. Some were bent double, gasping for air, while others clenched their jaws, determined not to show weakness. Lieutenant Commander Voss walked the line slowly, her eyes scanning each recruit. Her clip and stopwatch were silent, but her presence spoke volumes. "Front row," she called, her voice calm but sharp. "Bear crawl to the shoreline and back. Clock starts when the first elbow hits the sand." A few recruits groaned under their breath, but no one moved until she gave the signal. Just before it fell, a voice rang out from the rear of the formation. "Planning to run this like a yoga class, Commander?" It was Maddox, one of the senior instructors, leaning casually against the water trailer, arms crossed, a smug grin on his face. He looked her up and down, eyes narrowing behind his sunglasses. "What's the plan here, Commander? Some soft drills for the kids?" Voss didn't even glance at him. She raised her voice slightly, but only just enough to be heard over the waves. "Excuse me, Sergeant." The challenge in her voice was clear. Maddox stepped forward, bold now, a smirk still playing on his lips. "I said, these drills? Half the recruits here did harder stuff in high school wrestling. Are we aiming for participation trophies?" A few of the trainees nervously laughed, uncertain about how to respond. Voss, however, didn't flinch. She walked toward him slowly, her steps unhurried, her clipboard hanging loosely at her side. She stopped just outside his reach, her gaze unwavering. "What's your proposal, Sergeant?" she asked, her tone crisp. Maddox tilted his head, a glint of challenge in his eyes. "Maybe give them something real, something to separate the leaders from the followers." Voss stood perfectly still, her expression unreadable, as Maddox continued to smirk. For a moment the silence between them stretched longer than either of them anticipated. Then, without changing her tone, Voss spoke again. "Sergeant Maddox, you're assigned as support for the next 3 days. You'll run the shoreline drill for row 2. 10 laps, weighted packs. Every time someone drops, you double back and escort." Maddox's smirk faltered, but he recovered quickly. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but Voss was already walking away. She didn't wait for him to respond. The recruits in the front row dropped to the sand, their elbows hitting the ground and starting the clock. The air was thick with tension as Maddox stared after Voss, his pride wounded. He muttered to the instructor beside him, "She thinks she's in charge now." The instructor just nodded, a slight grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We'll remind her." Voss didn't need to look back to know what was happening behind her. She'd heard the whispers, seen the glances, but she didn't let it affect her. She had been through worse. This was nothing. The recruits struggled, but Maddox was the one who looked like he was about to break. Every time a recruit dropped from exhaustion, Maddox had to double back, escorting them in the harsh heat, his own pride slowly chipping away with every lap. The others watched. They knew something was coming. What they didn't know was that Voss had already made her move. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to command loudly. The entire formation was learning a lesson without a single word from her. As the day wore on, the heat of the sun grew unbearable, but the training continued relentlessly. The recruits were exhausted, their bodies aching under the weight of the vests, the sand sticking to their sweat-drenched skin. Voss moved with quiet authority, a presence that was felt even when she said nothing. By the time the drills had ended, the sun was sinking low over the horizon, casting long shadows across the field. Maddox, his uniform soaked with sweat, stood at the side, still fuming. He had been humiliated, but he had not yet given up. "She'll crack under pressure," he muttered, wiping his brow. "We just need to apply the right pressure." The other instructors exchanged uneasy glances, but none of them spoke. They had seen Voss's calm demeanor, the way she carried herself with a quiet strength that didn't need to be broadcasted. But Maddox wasn't the type to let go of a grudge. He'd seen this kind of officer before, the clean, pristine ones who never had the grit of those who had crawled through the mud. But this time, something about her made him uneasy. The next day, during a break in the training schedule, Maddox approached one of the junior instructors, leered. "We'll test her tonight," Maddox said, his voice low. "Simulation 3, a simple thing, just enough to make her question herself." Leard hesitated. "What if she doesn't respond the way you're expecting?" Maddox's smile was thin. "Then we'll remind her again, harder." The plan was set. Tonight's drill would be a test, not just of the recruits, but of Voss herself. The simulation would be the real challenge. But what Maddox didn't know was that Voss was already prepared. She had been watching. And she was ready to let the truth speak for itself. Night fell quickly over the training grounds, and the air grew cool with the promise of a restless evening. The obstacle course was dimly lit by floodlights, casting sharp shadows over the sand and gravel. The trainees were already gathered, preparing for the night rotation. Voss stood near the signal flag, her voice quiet but firm as she addressed the group. "Tonight's run is a live contingency simulation," she said. "You will face the same obstacles as before, but this time there will be no second chances. Work as a team, or you'll fail." Her tone was steady, unwavering, and the recruits sensed the shift. This wasn't just a drill. This was real. Behind her, Maddox, Leard, and Sutter stood with their arms crossed, watching the formation. They thought they knew what would happen. Voss would falter, just like the others before her. But they didn't know her. The first stages of the obstacle course ran smoothly. Crawls, vaults, rope swings. Nothing unusual, yet Voss felt something was off. The ropes were frayed in places where they shouldn't have been. One of the grip posts wobbled slightly under weight. It was subtle, but Voss's training had taught her to notice the small things. She filed it away, keeping her focus. But as they reached the cargo net tower, the real test began. She called for rotation, ready to lead the climb. "I'll take lead," she said, her voice calm. The other instructors stood silently as she began the ascent. Her movements were precise, calculated. Halfway up, disaster struck. The mid-beam of the tower gave way with a loud pop, and Voss dropped 6 feet, hitting the ground hard. The pain was immediate, sharp, and overwhelming. Her shoulder took the brunt of the fall, and the world flashed white at the edges. She fought to regain her breath, but before she could push herself up, Maddox was there. "You okay?" he asked, his tone feigning concern, but his grip on her arm was too tight. Voss didn't respond, but the others were already circling her. Laird stepped in next. "Shouldn't be climbing without a warm-up," he said, his voice low, almost mocking. Then, without warning, his boot nudged her hip. Not a kick, but enough to send a message. Voss didn't flinch. She sat up slowly, pain coursing through her ribs, but she stayed composed. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes never left them. Then came Maddox, pushing his advantage. His elbow drove into her ribs as he helped her up. It wasn't enough to make her fall, but it was a clear message. Voss caught herself, her breath sharp, but she didn't break. She stood tall, ignoring the growing ache in her body. 3 against 1. No cameras, no witnesses. Just pressure, designed to break her. But they underestimated her. She had been through worse. She had learned how to survive without ever raising her voice. The game was about to change. The night wore on, and the instructors watched, their smirks fading as Voss moved through the rest of the course with quiet determination. Each step was calculated, each motion precise. The recruits, who had once been nervous, now watched with growing respect. They saw the way Voss carried herself, the way she absorbed the pressure without ever showing weakness. By the time the last recruit finished the course, the instructors had stopped whispering, their voices replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Voss walked the course again alone, her shoulder aching with each step. She didn't need to look at the tower. She already knew what had happened. The beam had been tampered with, loosened just enough to fail under the strain. She had caught it the moment she started climbing. The faint wobble, the shift in the weight distribution, she had seen it before. Back in the desert, in another life, when the same pattern of sabotage had played out. But this time, she wasn't going to fight back with fists. She wasn't going to raise her voice. She was going to let the evidence speak for itself. The next morning, the training grounds were still and quiet as the sun rose over the horizon. Voss arrived early, her uniform neat, her posture perfect. She walked past the bulletin board where her name was posted once more, the same name that had been dismissed and ignored by her colleagues the day before. But this time, things were different. Maddox, still nursing the bruises to his pride, was already there, sitting at the instructor's table, trying to look nonchalant. Voss didn't acknowledge him. She didn't need to. She wasn't here for him. She was here to make sure the system remembered. As the day went on, Voss did her rounds, checking equipment, inspecting the course, noting the smallest discrepancies. But it wasn't until the afternoon that the real moment came. A sheet was posted on the board announcing the live evaluation. The instructors, now uneasy, gathered around it. Voss had arranged it all, and they hadn't even seen it coming. Live evaluation, instructor assessment drill, 1,600 hours, same course, same team, she said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. But this time, I'll be watching you. The day passed in a tense silence as the instructors readied themselves for the live evaluation. The recruits were given their final briefings, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation. Even the most experienced among the instructors sensed something was different. The air felt thicker, as though the ground beneath their feet had shifted without their notice. When the time came, Voss stood at the edge of the training field, her silhouette outlined by the fading sunlight. The simulation started with the usual exercises, but it was clear that something was amiss. Maddox, Laird, and Sutter were positioned at the course entrance, their movements mechanical, their minds clouded with the idea that they could still control the situation. As the recruits navigated the course, Voss remained silent, her eyes tracking every movement, every misstep. The obstacles had been set in motion. Voss's training had already been perfecting every detail in her mind. There were no cameras, no recording devices. This time, it wasn't about public spectacle, it was about truth. Then, the moment came. The cargo net tower, the same rig from the night before, now standing silently in the late afternoon light. As the recruits ascended, Voss stood by, her arms crossed, watching. Maddox made the first move, giving a subtle nod to Laird, as if signaling for something to go wrong. But this time, Voss was ready. She had already accounted for every possible move. The beam, now reinforced, held strong as the first recruit climbed. But the moment they hit the top, a subtle shift occurred. A spark of recognition flashed in Voss's eyes. It wasn't the tower that was going to break. It was their plan. "Stop the climb!" she called out sharply. The chorus immediately came to a halt. The instructors turned, confused. "What's the matter?" Laird asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Voss didn't respond immediately. She turned to the digital screen where the motion sensors were tracked, her fingers moving swiftly to pull up the logs. A small gasp rippled through the instructors as they saw what had happened. The logs weren't just tracking the climb, they were tracking them. Maddox's ID, Laird's actions, and Sutter's hesitations were all there, time-stamped in black and white. No sabotage this time, no physical intervention. Just facts, clean and undeniable. The room went silent as Voss stood, her gaze steady on the frozen display of the sensor log. Maddox, Laird, and Sutter exchanged looks, their faces draining of color as the implications settled in. They hadn't expected this. They had counted on her to fall, to make a mistake, to show vulnerability. But instead, she had outplayed them without lifting a finger. "You sabotaged the course, didn't you?" Voss's voice cut through the stillness, calm but cold. There was no anger in her tone, just the unshakable weight of truth. Maddox opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. His arrogance faltered for the first time. Voss didn't give him a chance to recover. "The override on the beam's safety lock, the tampered support, it's all logged. Your names, your timestamps, this isn't a question." The senior officers, who had been observing the evaluation from behind the curtain, now stepped forward. They could feel the shift, the inevitable wave of change that had begun to sweep through the training grounds. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no hiding behind pride or rank anymore. Captain Reeves, who had watched the simulation unfold, spoke quietly. "Sergeant Maddox, you'll be removed from this rotation effective immediately. Your actions constitute deliberate sabotage. Discharge proceedings begin at 0800. Maddox's face twisted with a mix of disbelief and rage, but he didn't argue. The evidence was undeniable. Beside him, Sutter shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had been there, witnessed everything, and had done nothing. "Sutter," Reeves said, his tone more measured, "you stood by, but you came forward when it mattered. You'll be pulled from this cycle. Your officer commission is rescinded." Sutter's throat tightened, and he nodded slowly, a deep shame settling in his chest. Laird, too, was silent. His face was a mask, but his eyes betrayed the turmoil beneath. It was over. The power had shifted, and Voss had won, not by force, but by patience, by precision, by waiting for the right moment. "Maddox, Laird, Sutter," Voss said, her voice final, "you failed to respect the chain of command. You failed to remember what discipline means, but you won't forget this." The debrief room was cold, the air thick with the weight of the consequences. No one spoke as the screen showed the final, damning footage. Maddox's ID, Laird's actions, the timestamp of their betrayal. It wasn't just the training that had been tested. It was the very core of what it meant to lead, to serve, to be part of something greater than oneself. The aftermath of the debrief was swift and clinical. Word spread quickly throughout the base, as it always did when the wheels of discipline turned. Instructors avoided Maddox's eyes, knowing the silence between them had been earned with far too many broken expectations. The trainees, though still in formation, walked with a new sense of respect for Voss. Whether they understood it or not, they recognized her presence had changed something fundamental in their world. Maddox left the room, his shoulders slumped, stripped of his rank and reputation, his pride shattered beyond repair. He didn't speak as he passed by Voss, nor did she acknowledge him. She just walked past him, eyes forward, her posture unyielding. No words were necessary. His fall was self-inflicted, and no apology would undo it. Outside, the air was still, the evening light stretching long across the field. The cargo net tower stood in the distance, reinforced now, a silent sentinel to the events that had unfolded. The instructors who had been part of the sabotage, once confident in their control, now faced the reality of their actions. Leard and Sutter walked in the opposite direction from Maddox, their heads low. They were no longer men who had upheld the training, but were now mere shadows of their former selves, tainted by the knowledge of what they had done. Back in her quarters, Voss took a moment to herself. The silence felt different now. It was not the silence of waiting, but the silence of victory, of discipline restored. She sat at her desk, reviewing the logs one final time. There was no need for a report, no need for applause. Everything had been documented, recorded, and filed away. It was done. Her thoughts briefly drifted to the recruits she had trained, to the new generation of soldiers who would carry the lessons of this day with them. They had seen a side of leadership they would never forget, a side that wasn't defined by rank or titles, but by the strength of character. As the night deepened, the sounds of the base quieted. The generators hummed softly, and the occasional patrol truck rumbled by. Voss turned off her tablet and stood, straightening her uniform. She didn't need to prove herself anymore. The system had seen. The lessons had been learned. She left the room without a second glance, her mind already on the next challenge that awaited. The tower might stand, but the real test would always be the men and women who trained beneath it. And as long as she walked this ground, they would never forget who taught them the hardest lesson of all. The sun rose slowly over the base the next morning, casting pale light over the training fields. The air was still, the quiet of the early hours broken only by the distant sounds of recruits beginning their morning routines. Voss stood by the edge of the compound, gazing out at the horizon. The events of the previous days had settled in her mind, but there was no sense of victory or satisfaction. Instead, there was only the calm realization that discipline had been restored, but the cost of that restoration was higher than anyone truly understood. As the day wore on, the recruits gathered for their regular drills, but there was an unspoken change in the air. Voss moved through the group, observing each one closely. The respect that had been earned the hard way still lingered. No one was laughing anymore. No one was underestimating her. Her quiet authority had become the bedrock of their expectations. Maddox, now officially removed from duty, walked through the compound with his head down, his uniform stripped of its rank insignia. He was no longer the instructor, the leader. He was a shadow, a cautionary tale. The others, including Leard and Sutter, had been pulled from their roles. Some of them, like Leard, seemed to understand their mistakes and walked quietly, their eyes heavy with guilt. Sutter, on the other hand, remained distant, lost in his thoughts, as if trying to reconcile the pressure of his own actions. He hadn't been the worst, but he had stood by and watched, a passive participant in a cycle of betrayal that he couldn't undo. The lessons of the past few days had been taught, but the real lessons, the ones that would define these soldiers, would take years to fully unfold. Voss didn't need to be the one to remind them. They would carry it with them, in every move, in every action. And as the recruits continued their drills, Voss walked alongside them, her posture as straight as ever, her mind already moving forward. The sun set over the base once more, and as the evening lights flickered on, a new chapter of discipline began, one that would resonate far beyond the walls of the compound. It wasn't about punishment. It was about ensuring that respect, hard-earned and unspoken, became the foundation of their future. The days passed in a blur of drills, assessments, and quiet moments of reflection. Voss continued her work, moving through the training sessions with the same calm precision she had always shown. The recruits were starting to adapt, not just to the physical demands of the exercises, but to the deeper lessons that Voss had instilled in them, lessons that went beyond strength and endurance. They were learning discipline, respect, and the true weight of leadership. Some struggled more than others. The quiet ones were the hardest to read, but their eyes, when they looked at her, spoke volumes. They had begun to understand that there was more to leadership than the loud, forceful commands they had expected. And then there were the others, the ones who had tested her in the beginning, the ones who had underestimated her. Now they watched from the sidelines, their expressions hard to read. It wasn't just respect they had for her now, it was something more profound. In a way, she had earned the kind of authority that couldn't be taken away, no matter how much they tried to shake it. As the weeks wore on, the shadow of Maddox's fall seemed to fade from the compound, but Voss could feel it in the undercurrent of every interaction, every whispered conversation among the trainees. She had proven herself, not with force or shouting, but with quiet resolve. One evening, just as the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Voss stood at the edge of the training field again. The tower loomed before her, no longer a symbol of failure, but of a hard-won lesson. The soldiers who had witnessed her fall and risen would carry the weight of that lesson long after she was gone. She didn't know what the future held, but she understood that the truth had already been set in motion. It would ripple through the military, through every training ground, every rank, until it became an undeniable part of the system itself. Respect wasn't about being the loudest or the strongest. It was about knowing when to stand silent and wait for the truth to reveal itself. And when it did, it was unstoppable. She turned from the tower, her mind already focused on what lay ahead. The work was never finished, but the path she had started was now unbreakable. The weeks blurred into one another as Voss continued her work, unshaken by the change in atmosphere around her. The recruits grew stronger, not just physically, but mentally. Each drill, each moment of discomfort, was a chance to prove themselves, not just to her, but to themselves. Voss's presence had become the touchstone for their growth. There was no need for excessive praise or reprimands. Her leadership was a quiet force that guided them, not with loud commands, but with the power of her example. Even the instructors who had once doubted her now showed subtle signs of respect. They watched her work, watched how she moved through the compound, always focused, always intentional. It wasn't the easy way, but it was the right way. The training was grueling, and there were days when even Voss felt the weight of it. But she had long since learned that leadership was about endurance, about pushing through when others might falter. It was in those quiet moments when the world seemed to stop, when she could hear the soft crunch of boots on gravel and feel the cool air against her face, that she found her clarity. The days were long, but they were hers. The system that had once seemed so rigid, so unyielding, had become something she could navigate with quiet precision. She had learned to work within it, to bend it without breaking. And in doing so, she had changed it. Her reputation had been solidified, not by any grand gesture, but by the small, everyday acts of leadership that had built up over time. Maddox's name had faded from the base, his legacy one of failure. But Voss's name, though never spoken loudly, was now known throughout the ranks. She didn't need to wear a badge or a trident. Her actions spoke louder than any decoration could. One evening, as the last of the recruits filed out of the training field, Voss stood at the edge, looking over the course. The shadows were long, and the air was heavy with the scent of salt and sand. She didn't move for a long time, just stood there, taking it all in. The light from the setting sun caught the edge of the tower, casting a golden hue over the reinforced structure. It was still there, still standing, and it had learned its lesson, just like the men and women who trained beneath it. The world moved on, but Voss knew that the truth would remain. Months passed, and Voss continued to observe from the sidelines, a constant presence in the lives of the recruits and instructors alike. The rhythm of life on the base had returned to its usual routine, but there was something different now, a quiet reverence that hung in the air whenever she entered a room. The recruits had grown accustomed to her unspoken leadership, and the instructors who had once mocked her or questioned her authority now sought her advice in subtle ways. They watched how she handled situations, how she never rushed, never forced an issue, but instead let her calm and controlled nature do the work. It was something that couldn't be taught in any manual or course. It was earned, in the silence of hard choices and unspoken understanding. One afternoon, as Voss reviewed the training schedules, she was interrupted by a knock on the door of her office. It was Sutter. He had been quiet for weeks, keeping to himself, avoiding the others. But today, he stood at her door, his posture a little different. He was no longer the hesitant recruit he had once been, but a man who had learned the hard lessons of discipline and respect. "Commander Voss," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of something unspoken, "I wanted to thank you." Voss didn't look up immediately, but she could sense the sincerity in his voice. She had seen the change in him. "For what?" she asked, her tone neutral. Sutter shifted his weight from foot to foot. "For showing me the truth about what it really means to lead." He paused, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face before he continued. "I didn't get it before. I didn't understand what it takes to be someone others follow." Voss stood up slowly, meeting his gaze. Her eyes softened, just slightly. "You didn't have to understand it all at once," she said quietly. "Leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about knowing when to listen, when to step forward, and when to stay silent. It's about carrying responsibility, even when no one's watching." Sutter nodded, absorbing her words. He still had a long way to go, but in that moment Voss saw the change. It was small, but it was real. It was the kind of change that could last. "Thank you, Commander," Sutter said, his voice more assured now, "for giving me the chance to prove myself." With that, he turned and walked out of her office, his back a little straighter than before. Voss watched him go, her expression unreadable. She didn't need thanks. She had already done what needed to be done. And as the evening sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the base, she knew that the lessons she had taught would ripple through the ranks for years to come. The truth had been set in motion, and it would never fade. The days continued to unfold in their steady, unrelenting rhythm. Voss kept her focus on the work, never wavering from the principles she had established. She didn't need praise, didn't need accolades. The respect she had earned, quietly and through the toughest of trials, was enough. The recruits who had once doubted her now understood the value of patience, of discipline, and of leadership that didn't shout to be heard but simply was. Her influence had permeated every corner of the training center, shaping the next generation of soldiers. It wasn't about power or rank anymore. It was about integrity. The air was colder now, the last vestiges of autumn giving way to the harsher winds of winter. One evening, after the last training session, Voss stood by the same cargo net tower where so much had changed. The base was nearly empty. The recruits had dispersed, and the instructors were finishing their final tasks for the day. For the first time in months, Voss allowed herself a brief moment of reflection. She thought back to everything that had brought her here, the struggles, the sacrifices, the moments where she had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right. And in the quiet of the evening, she realized she had never truly been alone. The work had always spoken for her, and in the silence, she had found the strength to carry on. Footsteps approached from behind, and she turned to find Senior Chief Moran standing a few paces away. "You've done something here, Rhea," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with respect. "They don't just listen to you, they follow you." Voss gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. "It wasn't just me," she replied softly. "It was the system. I just reminded them what it was supposed to be." Marin watched her for a moment, then let out a low breath. "Maybe. But you made sure it stayed on track." He paused before adding, "And for what it's worth, they remember, all of them. They know." Voss didn't respond. She didn't need to. The truth had already spoken for itself. "I think you've earned some peace," Marin said finally, his tone softer now. "When you're ready, the next phase is yours." Voss turned to face the tower once more, her eyes lingering on its silhouette against the fading sky. She didn't have the answers, and she didn't need them. The next phase would come, and when it did, she would be ready. She always was. As the evening darkened into night, Voss turned away from the tower, her footsteps echoing softly in the cold air. She didn't need to say anything. The change had already been made. The system had been reminded of what true discipline, leadership, and respect looked like, and no one would forget it any time soon. Jeśli ta historia poruszyła Cię emocjonalnie, zasubskrybuj nasz kanał, podziel się swoją opinią w komentarzach i udostępnij ten film innym.